let's shift. Let's talk about the scary right. Are you ready? I tried to do this with you about it.
We did the happy stuff first. Now we're going to plunge. Look, you know, Dave, when I began to research this thing, I probably ended up reading about 200 books on this topic in the end. And I'm a happy guy. I like happy things. I like technology. I'm an optimistic guy, but this really put me in a dark place, digging through this history. From Hegel essentially up to Julius Caesar Evola and the post-war Nazi movement, and realizing that there was an intellectual strain that stretched over all of these years.
Okay, so let's go back.
200 years, yeah.
So let's go back 200 years. When you talk about right-wing collectivism,
yeah.
Because I think most of my audience now understands what left-wing collectivism is, because that's what we've got right now, in a very strong way. Talk to me about right-wing collectivism.
Okay, Dave, I'm going to tell you a story. I love Ludwig von Mises. I think he was a genius, right? And I thought I'd read all of his works, but there is a transcript of a lecture he gave in 1956 at the San Francisco Public Library, and he had about 3 sentences in there that just knocked me over, and I couldn't believe it because it explains so much. He says something like this, and he's speaking casually, right? He says, Hegel ruined German philosophy for a century. His original followers believed that all of history would end in the Prussian state and the Prussian church having all power and the end of individualism. They became the right Hegelians that became the Nazis. The dissidents of this of the right Hegelians became the left Hegelians. They wanted a universal transformation of humanity and a historical drive to something other than the commercial society. They became the Marxists and the communists. And he said that's it. It's left-right Hegelianism, and that explains pretty much all of political history. And I closed that and I thought, that explains more than practically any other book I've ever read. And so I began to explore this. I understood the left Hegelianism. I understood Marxism. I mean, those were our professors, right? And they're annoying. But what I did not understand was the right Hegelianism and what that tradition looks like. It's the throne and altar, this historicist view that the nation should constitute its own unit of profound integrity that is more important than the individual, and that commercial society was too chaotic, that it was leading us, giving us the wrong kind of progress, that it was flattening out the hierarchies that we need to have an orderly life. Right? This is the right Hegelian pitch that ultimately, by mid-20th century, becomes this very dangerous movement in Europe. You know. It became catastrophic. But it gradually emerged all the way from Hegel, because this is at the end of the seemingly endless Franco-Prussian wars. There's this battle, the Battle of Jena, that Germany lost, and the explanation for that was that it was a temporary setback, that history was going to determine that Germany would rise. Despite the choices of individuals, history has got its wind. It's like a meta-narrative that was going to override everything. Hegel himself was a theologian, by the way. And so this view began to kind of spread throughout German academia, and it ended up being imported to the United States through circuitous means. But one of the great theorists of the 1840s and 1850s who brought this to the United States was Friedrich List, who was one of the first economists to repudiate the free trade tradition of the Smithian Manchesterites, and now was celebrating the nation as a unit, as a productive power, and believed in tariff walls, which was strange. And I've read his book. And that had a huge influence over American trade policy, actually, in the late 19th century. And it began to flow out from there. So Thomas Carlyle in Britain now begins to celebrate the great man theory of history. And really were nothing without Napoleon, without gigantic figures that we can worship, admire, and our individuality should be subsumed within them. They act for us. They're godlike, you know. And it was Thomas Carlyle who first coined the phrase to describe economics as being the dismal science. And the reason he said that is that every economist he knew imagined a world without slavery. And he said, you can't have a world without slavery. That's a dreadful world. Without slaves, you don't have masters, right? And we need a world with masters and slaves so we can have a vision of hierarchy and greatness. Without that, we don't have greatness. So you began to see this building of this intellectual apparatus. It was not left Hegelian. It wasn't Marxist. It was actually anti-Marxist in a strange way, but it was an alternative form of collectivism. It began with a kind of a historicism and a celebration of nationalism with the German state. It began to grow with this alternative theory of trade, that we should build up tariff walls. And Carlyle with his great man theory of history, and then Ruskin and Britain with his hatred of commercial society, because he believed that somehow commerce was ruining quality and culture and was giving us mass production. And what we all need to be really doing is living in guilds and making our own stuff, you know, because we're going to destroy English life and English country life. And so a full-scale reactionary trend on the right began to develop. And
was there always a racial element to it?
No. So that's what's interesting. I'm so glad you asked that, because it comes about, first of all, through nationalism. Now, in the early 1820s and 1830s, this celebration of nationalism. Now, you have to ask yourself, what is a nation? Right? What do we mean when we say nation? And I'm taking this a lot of this from an essay given in 1882 by Ernst Renan, a great French historian. Looking back at the rise of nationalism, said there's only 5 ways you can consider nationalism. You consider the geographic definition, so we're just living the space. There's a dynastic element. We can all trace our lineage back to the great founders of our nation. There's a language theory of nationalism. We all speak the same language. There's a religious theory of nationalism. We all worship God in precisely the same way. I believe in transubstantiation. You believe in consubstantiation. We can't be part of the same nation in that case, right? And then finally, and probably most insidiously, there was the racial view. And that came along in essentially the 1860s and 1870s with a misapplication of Darwinian theory, and scientific racism came along. And that swept through academia, particularly in the United States, like nothing you've ever seen. It was absolutely astonishing how much racism with orthodoxy in American academia in the 1890s. I mean, the very first monograph published by the American Economic Association by a guy named, I think his name is Andre Hoffman. It was called Race Traits of the American Negro. And the first chapter just goes all in. You know, it's the horror of the black people. They don't have the right values. They can't save money. They're just terrible, shiftless and lazy and ghastly and uncivilizable. And now chapter 2, the Jews. You know, these people, I don't know what, they've got this crazed, out of control commercial ethic. They can't stop hoarding money.
Man, they really went for it.
Yeah, and then the third chapter 3 is the Slavs, and so on, and so the American Economic Association, you know. And then, and there was essentially nothing.
What do you think was happening in the world there that it was taking?
I'll tell you what was happening, Dave. Laissez-faire had transformed society so dramatically that the intellectuals felt that they had lost control. Now, you might think that when the world becomes massively prosperous and we suddenly have cities rising up and we've got steel that is transversing large bodies of water and we're developing the telephone and indoor electricity and people are living longer lives and so much wealth is being created that everybody would stand up and say, hooray, we've found the answers.
But the gatekeepers who had controlled everything for so long, so that's so interesting because
there was a revolt.
This is sort of what it feels like now to me. The gatekeepers We've had so much success.
Yeah.
There's so many reasons right now to understand how great everything is. That book right there by Steven Pinker, Enlightenment
It's a
Now,
great book.
is all about how great things are and how
It's a great
actually
book.
there is less violence now and all sorts of
No,
wonderful
and,
things.
and so the revolt, you always have to be on the...
But the gatekeepers aren't happy
They are not
when the
happy.
narrative
The
shifts.
intellectuals are what Deirdre McCloskey calls the clerisy, right? So it's the high-end intellectuals, it's the power elite bureaucrats and the public, the permanent keepers of our civic culture. You know, it's the political class, and
so this is sort of what for my audience that maybe not following all this. This is sort of what the New York Times is, sort of, right? Like,
yeah,
maybe I shouldn't have said it so obviously, but like that's kind of what it is. Like that class,
the ruling class.
Yeah.
The ruling class. And they were in full-scale revolt. They did not like what was happening to the world in the 1880s and 90s because of the loss of control. And so the scientific racism came along to add to the celebration of dictatorship and protectionism and the new nationalism, to add a very insidious element which culminated in eugenics ideology. And that's when it gets very strange. And this is where the reading gets very difficult, because now you're reading all the way into the 1910s with the works of Oswald Spengler, you know, the right Hegelian German theorist that enraptured every American. You know, they were all reading his book. Oh my God, The Decline of the West. We better reconstitute ourselves as a tribe, or we're going to be eaten alive by all the other foreigners. And then,
but there's a strain of that that's still going on right now.
There's nothing new. You know, like, and you know, this very funny book called The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant. That was on every coffee table in the late 19-teens and early 1920s. You know, was forecasting doom for the white race. You know, and he was a fascinating figure because, you know, of course I read his book as did everybody did. The Great Gatsby makes a passing reference to it. It was that popular. Huh. It was that popular. And I tell you, there's not a single alt-right racist alive today who is not repeating those cliches that were written by Madison Grant. It's all pseudoscience. It's all just nonsense, and it's just ridiculous, embarrassing. But it keeps being resurrected. But here's what's interesting: he was a thoroughgoing Darwinian, because you recall that Darwin had two great books, The Origin of Species. The other was called The Descent of Man. Mm-hmm. And The Descent of Man had the very unfortunate paragraph in there where he regrets the invention of mass disease-killing cures, essentially. It's like if we keep curing people and we keep feeding inferior people and curing disease, then our genetic stock's just going to go down and down. You know, so they are all kind of playing off this little passage. But Madison Grant was not unusual by American academic standards at all. This was orthodox in the 1810s and 1820s. What made Madison Grant interesting, you can look up his Wikipedia entry right now. If you look it up, it'll celebrate him as the father of the National Park Service. Well, in the course of my research, I wanted to know, what is the connection between Madison Grant's hardcore eugenics-based racism and his environmentalism? What is the relationship there? And it's not just two people. Usually people have it figured out in their own heads. I went through and read some of his works on the environment. It turns out that he had a master race theory of nature. And he went to the California redwoods and he looked at these glorious, mighty trees. And he was horrified to see they were being cut down for making coffee tables and boats and things like that. And he thought it was dysgenic to nature. Huh. So he wanted the master race, the California redwoods, to be protected. And so that's why he started the National Park Service. And, wow. And now the left heralds him as a great visionary environmentalist, but actually, he was like a tree Nazi. I don't know how else you want to call it.
A tree Nazi.
Yeah, it's very creepy stuff.
We don't have enough Nazi labels being thrown around now. We're going to have tree Nazis. Yeah, I'm sure that already
exists.
He
was nuts. But you know, you can just march through the history, and it gets worse and worse. And then, to me, Dave, it all culminates in the works of Carl Schmitt. From the late 1930s, and his amazing book called The Concept of the Political. And if you'll give me just one quick second to explain this, because you as a liberal need to read this book, because it's the most passionate, I would say, and even competent attack on liberalism written in the 20th century. Now, Carl Schmitt was a jurist, a brilliant man and a philosopher, and a hardcore Nazi. Okay? He wasn't tried at Nuremberg, he escaped. I'm merely an intellectual. Okay, sure. His book, Concept of the Political, says, what's wrong with liberalism? I'll tell you. It's dull. Nothing happens. Nothing dramatic. There's nothing, just requires no courage whatsoever. Liberalism is a life in which we all benefit from each other's presence. We all just trade with each other. What kind of life is that? Where we all just are kind of the same and like each other and hold backyard barbecues and go to baseball games and just get richer and live longer lives and send our kid to college. This is terrible. We need to live big, dramatic, mighty, bold, courageous, transformative lives and live in times that are shocking, that are amazing, that make our lives worth living. That requires, above all else, politics. Liberalism imagines a world without politics. That's a terrifying world. What we need is a world of politics. And he continues to lay it out, chapter by chapter, why we have to destroy liberalism and celebrate the concept of the political. And for him, that means having friends and having enemies, defeating your enemies and rallying around your friends. Now, who are your friends and who are your enemies? And Carl Schmitt says, at some level, it doesn't matter. What matters is that they exist, and the state, the powerful men, will choose them for us. They will decide who our friends and our enemies are. Now, let's be clear what we mean by enemy. I just don't mean somebody you don't like. I mean the willingness to kill. There has to be the presence of real bloodshed in your time for you to have a sufficiently prescient sense of eneminess so that you'll feel the intense desire to rally around your friends and experience the awesomeness that only comes with belonging to a group. So he says.
But the end feeling there is that you can't achieve what the real purpose of a human is.
That's right.
That you can't experience whatever the highs of humanity
of
are.
Group belongingness, essentially, and the life of drama, a big, important life,
right,
without being part of a kind of a group on the move that's slaughtering its enemies. And so we have to have the presence of bloodshed.
So it really is the opposite of live and let live.
It is. It's so through bloodshed comes life. And without bloodshed and death and violence and politics, then you're just going to live an irrelevant life, and we can't have that. So he was, in many ways, the philosophical architect of the Holocaust. Again, not a leftist, not a Marxist, although he dabbled in it. You find this from a lot of these right collectivists, the right Hegelians, that they dabbled. Guys like Werner Sombart, right? He was once a communist who later became a Nazi. Carl Schmitt dabbled in leftism and then went full right. And it was, in many ways, the culmination of the right Hegelian ideology in Carl Schmitt. So it's a book worth reading and contemplating. And I would say to anybody who rejects liberalism, be honest about where you're going with this. This is the opposite of liberalism is celebration of death in the works of Carl Schmitt. Very powerful thinker. Highly regarded, even today. Worth reading and worth reflecting on. What kind of world do you want to live in? You want to live at peace with others? Or do you want to slaughter your friends, slaughter your enemies and rally with your friends?
So move me from that point, 1930s, into, of course, obviously into Nazi Germany, and then we'll
so
finish where we are now.
Yeah, and my book really does end in 1950. Not necessarily, it didn't have to, but I started to get really queasy about what happened after World War II. A lot of the right Hegelian movement went underground, and became a kind of a quiet neo-Nazi movement that never really had access to social media. Clearly they weren't in academia, obviously, but the ideology never entirely went away. And it was just lying in waiting for the failure of the left and for the resentment of the population against the left to rise up and get a fevered enough pitch that it would then come on full force. And that's really what's happening in Europe, Russia, United States. It's an alternative form of collectivism. It's got a different flavor, a different orientation, a different kind of resentments. But it still drags in this gigantic history of right Hegelian ideology, the celebration of the great man dictator, the protectionism, the anti-immigration, the nativism, the nationalism. It could take any one of 5 forms, including the racism.
What do you make about how now, and it's obviously largely because of the internet, it
Yeah.
seems to be happening in so many places at once? We're seeing this it's an oddly unholy alliance
It is.
between the collectivist left, and then that drives, I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. Then you've got this other thing that's
Yeah.
just waiting there for these guys to go too bananas,
Yeah.
and then it's like, we got all the easy answers. Meanwhile, you have the liberals and all the decent 80% of us
Yeah.
that are trying to live and let live.
So
just
part
get
of
caught.
part of it really comes down to this. There's a weird sociological, cultural contradiction at the heart of social democratic leftist ideology. On one hand, they wanted to build gigantic institutions that are redistributatory, and we're supposed to treat each other like a big family, and we're supposed to have this homogeneous nation state. On the other hand, they're celebrating diversity and encouraging mass immigration and heterogeneous populations. And guess what? Those don't really work together. So you build gigantic states that presume sort of that we're all one family, and then you throw in this diverse set of people, especially with the refugee crisis in Europe and immigration in the United States, and people are looking around going, these people aren't my family. I don't even like these people.
Yeah.
And yet I'm paying for them. I mean, that is a prescription. I mean, that blows
Yeah.
up. I mean, that's a disaster. It's a powder keg. And so is the left and this core contradiction that they have between a welfare state on one hand and their celebration of heterogeneous populations on the other. Welfare state and diversity, they don't work.
And that basically puts us where Germany sort of is at right now,
Yeah.
right? Where they said, okay, 3 million people come on in. Now all these people are going to have to pay for you. We're not going to integrate you properly. I mean, this is not only in
Now
Germany.
you've got the identitarian movements rising up in Germany and in Hungary and of course in Russia and of course the US. So it all just kind of follows. It's inevitable. The left created this. I mean, if after World War II we had just embraced liberalism like we should have, we wouldn't be where we are today. But we have another chance, and that's why you're here, and that's why I'm here. We have another chance now to re-embrace liberal theory, and to reject the left. And don't feel yourself just because the enemy of your enemy is there. It doesn't mean it has to be your friend. I mean, we really do need to think of ourselves as kind of a dissidents from a political culture that rally around freedom and human rights and universal human rights and the ennoblement of humanity, the championing of the common person, the rights of everyone to live freely with each other, to gain value from each other, and to live in peace, and stop thinking of our fellow human beings as possible enemies. We don't want to get drafted into the political world that Carl Schmitt imagined for us. As I was describing Carl Schmitt, you see it happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
That Schmittian view to slice and dice the population. Who do you like? Who do you hate? Who are your people? This is not a good life.
Yeah, and we feel
It's
it
a
chopping
miserable
away
life.
at both sides, right?
Yeah, we do. We feel it. And so I just don't feel like we have to be part of it. I mean, as best we can, let's find things we love, and go places we love, be with people we love, of all different backgrounds, all different kind of cultures. Learn about alternative religions. Learn about new ways to do things. Travel, right? In the age of liberalism, there were no such things as passports, Beautiful.
All right, so let's spend the last portion here on just these last 5 years, really here in America. Because I remember it doesn't have to be the last 5 years, but let's say even 3 years ago, just at sort of the emergence of Trump as a candidate, when people started saying the phrase alt-right.
Yeah.
And I did a bunch of videos on it where I was basically saying I see two strains to this thing. And people are now using this video against me. And what I saw was there was the sort of fun meme makers and all of the people who were having fun online, often doing awful things and Nazi imagery just to upset people in power and whatever, but sometimes very fun things too and funny things. But I saw just the real sort of shit posters, as they're known, and the Pepe people. The whole idea was we could start sending a frog to some intellectual, and they're going to think that's a racist thing, and then they would say, I'm being under attack from racists. They would actually give them exactly what they wanted. So I saw this sort of fun shit posting, whatever part of it. Not to say it didn't have elements I didn't like, but I saw that as the bulk of it. And then alongside of that was this that you're talking about, the identitarian part, the true racist part, the part that had been sort of underground for a long time, and then because of social media, now is finding that it could actually influence people and be powerful. Okay, so now And and I think the media really fueled both of those things, because basically when Hillary said that deplorables comment, she just lumped the whole damn thing together. And I think if she had not said that, I think it's very possible she'd be president now. And
she helped the cause. She almost made the alt-right exist. But
my question really is, how would you just define the alt-right? Flat out, if I asked you right now, because I think the definition has changed a little bit. But if I asked you right now in the summer of 2018, what the definition of alt-right is?
The phrase alt-right comes about, 10 years ago. I think it was coined by Paul Gottfried, who himself is a follower of Carl Schmitt. I would rather look at this as a right Hegelian collectivist movement, in general, that stretches from the early 19th century all the way up to the present. That's characterized by a love of dictatorship, a love of power, protectionist trade policy, nativist immigration policy, and a resentment against commercial life because it's too heterogeneous and too ennobling of humanity. I mean, that to me, the alt-right is one species, I guess you could say, one flavoring, one instantiation of a much larger problem that stretches way back, which is an illiberal theory of life, an illiberal theory of politics. So that's, I think, the right way to think about it. And the first time I heard Trump speak was July 2015, and I don't even think we were using the term alt-right at the time. But he opened his speech with, the immigrants are a problem. I thought, Then it was protection, the foreign goods, protectionism, we need protectionism. I thought, And his third big point was, I can fix everything. I thought, this is all sounding strangely familiar to me, That's like the three pillars of right Hegelian ideology, essentially. And I realized we had a problem. And I understand, I do, why people had a high regard for him. He was going to save us from the problems that Obama had created, and God knows those problems. And the left has gotten just bonkers, right? So we need protection from that. But he introduced his own form of problems, and he unleashed its own form of dangers and potentially very despotic arrangements of power. And in some ways they're more insidious because they appeal to bourgeoisie. The left has always been a little bit culturally estranged, from the mainstream of American life, whereas Trump connects very closely with it. This is why fascist movements have been oftentimes much more successful than left socialist ones.
Wait, I gotta get this, because I would have thought the opposite. So if you would have asked me before you said that, I would say the left is the one that has understood the culture part of this, at least in the American piece of this. Certainly academia and culture, what you could and couldn't joke about.
Sure, but that's high culture.
Yeah.
The left is, as Hayek said, socialist ideology never came from below. It was never a working man's philosophy. It was always the intellectuals. It was a top-down rule. It was always the ruling class that hatched socialist ideology. There never would have been communism, socialism, all these things without the intellectual class. But fascism, if you'll allow me to use that term, kind of flips the narrative a little bit. It's much more of a from below. It's you can keep your religion. You can keep your nationhood, your identity, your race, your language, rally around your friends, your family, all the things that you believe are true you. And within me as a person, as a leader, I will embody all your values and collectivize us in a way that means something important, that connects with who you are. So in that sense, it's a very effective way of being illiberal.
All right, so all that said, what is our way out of this precarious position? I think I get what you're...
Yeah.
I get the theme of what you're doing here, is we have to just keep fighting for what we believe in and be better.
Well, so Dave, I think we need to rethink who we are. I think we need to deepen and enrich our understanding of who we are and what we're here to do. And it goes back centuries. I mean, it was the liberalism that dug us out of feudalism, that ended the guilds, that brought us free trade, that ended slavery, that really gave birth to the modern world. And we need to learn to take credit for that and make that ethos our ethos. Go back and read the works of Adam Smith and the great Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, and understand our history so we understand ourselves better. I think this is important because we need to stop thinking of ourselves, even though we are radicals. I think you are, I think I am. Well, I almost believe that we should stop thinking of ourselves that way. We should think of ourselves as normal.
If I'm a radical, then the phrase radical, it's definitely not as cool as it used to be. I mean, I think I'm open to these ideas, and I guess being open right now and being really living up to the ideals that you've set forth here is radical these days.
It kind of is, and maybe liberalism has always been a radical creed because it opposes power. It always has been opposed to power. That's what we have to do now. But we also have to celebrate regular life. You know, we have to celebrate the good life and the beautiful things and the things we love, the people we love, and the choices that we can make and the technologies we can use. And I fall in love with the new technology every single day. I came over to see you with this new funny pillow that I bought for $10 on Amazon. It allows me to sleep sitting straight up, and I'm enraptured by that. I think this is the way to happiness, and I think ultimately it's the path to political victory for us too. To be more hopeful, to be more cheerful, to celebrate life, and celebrate love, and celebrate wealth in a way in which neither the left or the right are doing right now. It gives us an opening to be awesome, to emancipate the world. We can do this.
I got nothing better to do. For more on Jeffrey, follow him on Twitter, Jeffrey A. Tucker.